Welcome to the Brain Soup Podcast with your host, Jane. Now, normally I would try to play music for you all. You know, this will snippets because I want to show what I'm talking about. But I got copyrighted last time for that, so no, I'm not doing it again. Not going for that again. But we're still going to have fun. So just bear with me here. Today we're going to talk about a topic I always been interested in since I got into youth culture and stuff. And that is the birth of the teenager. Now, I know what you're thinking. Jane, you're like 21. You're going to be 22 soon. Why are you talking about teenagers? Well, for one, I find history very interesting. For two, 20 ain't so far away from a teenager, believe it or not. I mean, yeah, you got more rights, but in many cases, some people still view you as a teenager. So it's kind of interesting in that aspect of. And for free, to be honest, I just want to talk about how this all began and stuff. Now, to pinpoint it, teenager was defined by 1944 Americans started using the word teenager to basically to put in place of the youth in their society from the very beginning. Meaning, at the time, teenagers were starting to get their identity. Now, before that, teenagers didn't really assist. Yes, the numbers did, but really, teenagers just kind of was just adults at that point. You had to go to work. You had to, you couldn't do much. Until 1944. That's kind of when something shifted in youth culture. You see, kids were starting to buy rhythm and blues records. They were starting to go out to movies. They were starting to be teenagers. And what's interesting about this, by the term of the 1950s, rock and roll came out. This was kind of like the beginning of rock and roll, horror comics, monster movies. They were starting to market to teenagers. One of these movies what marketed to teenagers was 1955's Blackboard Jungle. Now, Blackboard Jungle was a movie about rebellious teenage youth like in a attention center. I never seen it really. I seen bits and pieces of it. But it's interesting to see though, because that was actually the first movie what they ever used Walk Around the Clock. Now I know what you're thinking. That song is ridiculous, which it is, but for the time, you got to remember the time period it's in. That song was considered rebellious, right? Which was interesting because the movie, from my understanding, was pretty much why you shouldn't be a Hueyan. It's interesting. And remember when I said rhythm and blues, what would eventually turn into rock and roll, basically. A lot of radio stations were called teenage stations. Now, before it was just called race records, because a lot of those records were abandoned by black folks. But basically, by the turn of the 50s, they start calling it teenage records or rock and roll. Now, what I kind of get out of it, especially because I wasn't there at the time, I think it was starting to bloom into the new era. Because rock and roll wasn't only going on, but you also had the beatniks. Right? You had the beatniks. You had jazz at the same time, which jazz been around for a little while now. You had poets going on, and by the bloom of the 60s, that's kind of when you get the whole new counterculture. At first it was the mods, and you got the hippies by the end of it. In the 70s, you get the punk counterculture, which was kind of, what was interesting, it was rebellious, but it was almost every singlet you saw prior. But what was interesting about that, though, it was new at the same time. I mean, just look at the band like the Cramps, right? We talked about the Cramps before. I did a review of the Cramps. The Cramps took a lot of influence from rockabilly, but from the 50s. But what was interesting, though, they did it in their own way. So yeah, it's interesting how it kind of came to peace, you know? Now, before I get off and leave, I just want to say, what were you like as a teenager? What were you into musically or whatever? Were you into any pop culture? Personally, when I was a teenager, I was very into grunge. I still am in many cases. Punk, grunge. Actually, when I was an early teenager, I started getting into early rock and roll, so that would be like middle school. So yeah, like, what were you guys into, and how did you guys develop that and evolve? I always find that interesting about people, how they really evolved since then, and, you know, I don't know, it's just interesting to me. So have a good day, and bye-bye.